Hello and welcome to another episode of Crushing Comics. I'm your host, Peter, and we are here to fall in love with my comic book collection all over again. At least all over again for me. You're seeing it perhaps for the first time. I've got a book I've already picked off the shelf here. And to talk about while I unwrap it, I actually want to talk about what I meant to talk about last episode before I got distracted by my Clue shirt, which was the idea of guilty pleasures. So I don't believe in them. I think if you like something, just like it, dude. Like, why does it have to be a guilty pleasure? I think the only thing for me that comes close to a guilty pleasure is like a food that I know to be bad for me that I still like to eat. And like, not just like something like cheese, which could be, you know, fattening for me, but something that really has intrinsically no value whatsoever. So like my wife really likes those like sour ropes. Like they're not quite licorice. They're kind of just like sour fruit by the foot sort of. And I really love that sour sugar taste that like Sour Patch Kids have. And I usually really try to stay away from any kind of like candy in general, but especially that kind of gummy candy because it's all just junk. Like it doesn't have any nutritional value whatsoever. But I would say that that's a guilty pleasure for me. But the reason I was thinking about it when I had that Clue shirt on was because I was on the Omnibus live stream recently talking about the Marvel movies, and I just happened to let slip that Clue is my favorite movie. I love it. It's been my favorite movie for a long time. I like it because it works on several different levels. It's farcical and slapstick, but then it's also actually this very deep, kind of message about the Red Scare and McCarthyism, and that people that ranged from just being themselves and being a homosexual all the way to being like murderers and war profiteers were all under the same microscope in McCarthyism. And the movie taught me that. Like I kind of got that as a kid, but I've come to appreciate it so much more as I've grown up. And one of the comments was like, Clue, are you sure? Do you want to come back next week and tell us maybe that Clue is not one of your favorite movies? And like, I have no guilt around that. If it wasn't one of my favorite movies, I wouldn't have said it. And for that matter, what if one of my favorite movies was Fast and Furious? That's a guilty pleasure, I assume, for some people. But there's things that you like about it too. You like what you like. And so I kind of think like guilty pleasure infers that there's some guilt in your consumption of it. And I do have guilt in consumption of Sour Patch Kids, but I have no guilt in the consumption of Clue. Okay. So I am a frequent member, chatter, collaborator in the Omnibus Collectors Facebook group. And there's this running joke whenever anybody says, what should I buy next or whatever, that the answer is always Atlantis Attacks. And it is meant to be a joke because Atlantis Attacks is like seen as like, oh my god, why would you buy that? Except for I love Atlantis Attacks. It is in fact what you might think of as a guilty pleasure, although again, I have no guilt in that whatsoever. And oh, that's great. Okay, so before we get there, the first book here is Evolutionary War, and I think I can explain Evolutionary War, and then we'll get to Atlantis Attacks, and I'll have a better frame of reference. So Marvel had come off from doing Marvel Secret Wars in 84 and 85, Secret Wars 2 in 1986, and so they were kind of addicted to these big crossovers, and DC was too in the wake of Crisis. But they also had they were really destabilizing for the whole line, because in order to do all of these tie-ins to the central series, you had to basically like compel all of these authors to interrupt the main thrust of their book to make space for this other thing. And if you wanted to use your biggest books, your X-Men, your Spider-Man, your Captain America, then you had to convince their authors to find the room to tie in for this stuff. And it's difficult. And so, and what you see as the Marvel events continue into Infinity War in the 90s, or Infinity Gauntlet, and then War and the Crusade, is that the big books stopped tying in, and it really became more about promoting the sales of the smaller books, because the big books were just going to do their own thing. In between the original all-in version of Secret Wars 2 and the the lesser titles going in on Infinity Gauntlet and beyond, came the idea that why don't we just serialize the crossover, no central event, no limited series, let's just serialize it through our annuals. And that way it doesn't interrupt the run of any of the main titles, but we can get all the main titles to participate. And so the first time Marvel really did that was in Evolutionary War. And Evolutionary War, the titles were some of Marvel's biggest titles. It was, let's see, all of the Spider-Man books that had annuals, so Amazing Spider-Man and Spectacular Spider-Man and Web of Spider-Man, all of the X books that had annuals, X Factor, Uncanny X-Men, and New Mutants, both of the Avengers books, Avengers and Avengers West Coast, and then also Punisher and Silver Surfer. So that's a lot of really high quality comic books. It's the bulk of Marvel's popular line. So it doesn't include the individual Avengers. Oh, and Fantastic Four too. So it doesn't include, you know, like Cap and Thor and Iron Man, but it's a pretty big crossover. And it basically, you know, makes High Evolutionary, who had just been like an occasional character in Avengers and Fantastic Four, into like somebody who has the scope of being able to threaten the entire universe full of characters. And this happens during some very kind of like fraught times in these books. You know, X Factor, it's in the middle of their struggles with Apocalypse, and High Evolutionary actually is a wonderful counterpart to Apocalypse, and you actually get them facing off with each other, which maybe wouldn't have been something that could have been carried off in the proper title itself, because it would have interrupted what was happening. That's in X Factor Annual 3. In Uncanny X-Men, we were in the middle of all different stuff happening. This is around the period of, I guess, Mutant Massacre, and Claremont probably couldn't have interrupted his actual run, but he finds a way to fit this story in. And the same is true for Amazing Spider-Man. A lot of stuff is happening in that title right at that point, and this introduces Speedball. So, like, you know, originates a character that winds up going into the New Warriors, and also finds room for Spider-Man to tell that story. So I actually am less familiar with this story. I've read some of the individual annuals, but I've never read the whole thing. But the reason I bought this is because I started to have this concept of having this whole Marvel event shelf that had every Marvel event that had ever evented. So then the next year, Marvel decides to go even bigger and does an annuals crossover, Atlantis Attacks. This has all of the participants of the prior year, as well as adding the solo Avengers titles of Iron Man and Thor, and it also adds Daredevil. So it's even bigger in scope than the one the prior year. And Atlantis Attacks is an interesting serialized story because it takes an existing artifact in the Avengers pantheon, the Serpent Crown, and it details how the rogue Atlanteans are trying to resurrect their god Set, and that it's going to take the Serpent Crown to do that. And in order to do that, they need to assemble a group of Marvel's women to use as their captives / sacrifices. So you can see a lot of major Marvel female characters there. And so the story crosses over all of these annuals without all of the characters needing to come along, because it becomes not only about all of the characters like fighting against the Atlanteans, but it also becomes about like all of the characters kind of the teams that these women were on, fending off the women being taken captive. And as a backup to each of these stories, there was the story of the actual Serpent Crown and how it came to be, and how it, you know, its deep history. Part of why I love these, and I have a lot of these in individual comic books, because it was right around when I started collecting, only like a year or two before, and so the books were readily available, and the covers are just gorgeous. This Punisher cover with Moon Knight is really one of my all-time favorites. I love it. And then also the New Mutants cover is just wild. I love it so much. And even the X Factor cover, actually, talking about like vivid covers. And this was the era where they used a lot of pink. So look at that. Like, is it a Tuma? Yeah, Tuma, like drowning Jean Grey while Beast is in the distance being held back. Just like a super, super dramatic cover. So I had seen the covers of these books, and I had some of them, and I never had all of it, and so it just was like one of these elusive things. And when they said that it was going to come out in Omnibus, I'm like, yes, sold. I've always wanted to read this whole story. The books don't even look that good now because these are, you know, annuals at the time that were like 15 years old. And I was just so excited to get them all in one place that I was like a little kid, like, oh, it's coming out. And this was in my first Sears catalog purchase of a comic book starter kit that had, like, you know, 30 Marvel comic books in it to help fill your first short box. And one of my comics was this New Mutants annual. Again, awesome pink coloring here, and it's got Boom Boom front and center with Richter. It is no coincidence that they go on to be two of my favorite X-Men characters of all time. So I was really excited to get this. It was one of those books I remember I like sat down on the floor of my office at the time back in Philly and ripped the cellophane off and immediately started paging through it. So the other cool thing that this book does is it actually runs all of those Saga of the Serpent Crown stories sequentially in the back in the right order, so that you can just read them separately. Whereas if you were surrounded by the individual issues in a room, you would have to kind of like open each one in sequence to read these little 2-page tales. So this was really part of Marvel dedicating themselves and saying, like, we're really going to collect all of our events in Omnibus. We have Secret Wars 2, these two, Infinity Gauntlet, and then they stalled out. Dudes, they totally stalled out. So, and actually also Acts of Vengeance is part of that lineage as well. So we don't have an Infinity War or Infinity Crusade Omnibus. Everybody was so sure we were going to get an Infinity War Omnibus this year with the movie coming out. Instead, we're getting a box set that's all of the Infinity with all of the tie-ins, including a lot of books that have never been printed before, but it's not the same as getting the Omnibus. So there's still a gap in our Marvel Omnibus events lineup where we need some more of the 90s events if we're going to have a completed bookshelf. And I hope they come out eventually. I would absolutely buy them. I think it's really something cool to see the evolution of the Marvel characters getting together and fighting off threats all in an assembled way from the beginning of the concept of that with Secret Wars. Hell, they could put one out that goes before Secret Wars that would be Contest of Champions, because that was truly the first Marvel event. But happy to have them, and when I am saying that you should buy Atlantis Attacks, I'm not joking, because I think it's one of these great examples that's a great cross-section of all of the different Marvel titles and what was happening at the time, at the point where annuals were like still cared about by the main creative team on the books. And you'll see that in a lot of these books in Atlantis Attacks, that the main team did write the main story in the annual. Claremont wrote the X-Men story, Englehart wrote the Silver Surfer, David Michelinie wrote the Iron Man and the Amazing Spider-Man. Only a few of them were kind of pinch hit people, and even the pinch hit people were good. So John Byrne wrote the X Factor annual. He was not the person writing X Factor at that point, although I believe some of that X Factor annual might even still be penciled by the main artist. Maybe not. No, he actually also penciled it. But you know, this is a strong group of writers. Jerry Conway handled all of the Spider-Man ones. Louise Simonson handled New Mutants. So these were the regular creative teams. That would change in just a few years. Marvel started taking this annuals crossover concept and breaking it up into little subgroups of annuals, and they did that for 3 years running, 90, 91, and 92. And so they would have like just the X-Men group crossover with each other. Maybe I'm 1 year off on that. They would have just the solo Avengers crossover with each other and do these little stories, you know. The Days of Future Present is one of those stories. The Return of the Defenders is one of those stories. And those books didn't feel as much a piece of the normal run because they basically like took other creators and said, oh, you should handle this because it's a crossover across all 4 of these books. So these were the only 2 years that Marvel did this all annuals thing, and it wound up being what DC did for years and years. The majority of DC's big line crossovers in the 90s were like this, and a lot of times they're out of continuity. So Year One, Elseworlds, the DC did a lot of annuals of this nature, and that was how they handled their line-wide crossovers apart from big ones like 0 Hour and Underworld Unleashed. So here's the official shelving of a book that I love very much and also another book that I've never read, and that would be Marvel's Atlantis Attacks and Marvel's Evolutionary War. Did I say official shelving? Because it's ceremonial. It's their ceremonial shelving. Ceremonial shelving. Okay. So thanks for joining me for that treatise on non-guilty pleasures. Just pleasures. Pleasures. Join me again as we open what is just a handful more of wrapped books here, which I think I have a pretty good shot of loving a lot because I think they're all Marvel from here on out. So thank you so much for tuning in to Crushing Comics.